Everyone. The mic is not working. Hold it close. How's that? Okay. Okay. Don't worry. If you don't hear me, you won't miss much. The important thing is here in the front row. So today I have the pleasure of introducing one of the most popular speakers in the Adult Forum series, and that's Reverend Larry Pinnow. He's you want to give him a round of applause already? There you go. Hey. He's a familiar face to many of you who've heard him speak before and who knew him when he was a visiting pastor here at Midvale. He's served congregations in Racine and Monroe and Madison, and is an interim pastor in 12 different congregations. So Reverend Pinnow is going to be discussing Christian nationalism today. So I'm new to this topic, so I asked him about it at our adult summer Bible school. And that was on September 1st of this year. And he told me he had read 5 books on Christian nationalism, and he was just getting started. So I want to thank you in advance, Reverend Pinnow, for taking on all of this reading and all of this study on behalf of all of us, and for doing it through the lens of faith. So today he's going to be discussing the deep roots of Christian nationalism in American history. And he's also going to be taking us on a journey tracing the merger of religion and empire from the beginnings of Christendom through the present day. So strap up for a journey through Christian nationalism with our able guide, Reverend Pinnow.
Thank you. Can you please hear me and tell me if you can hear me? Thanks.
Good morning, Faith community. Thank you for that introduction, Karen. I'm going to have to quit doing this because the introductions far exceed my abilities. Well, I think we had a good introduction last week to Christian nationalism, and Carolyn and I talked about the fact we were wondering whether it was out of order or not. But we kind of concluded that I think the order worked well, because last week we got an introduction and the implications of Christian nationalism. And now we can step back and look at how it is that we got here. And that's what I want to do today, is talk about how it is that we got to this point, tracing back a long ways, as Karen said, to the very beginnings of Christianity. Christian nationalism is not something we heard about 20 years ago. I don't think. I didn't anyway, maybe even 10 years ago. But it's not something that happened overnight. It didn't even happen since Donald Trump. There has been a growing movement to gain power by conflating, that is, bringing together a sense of of national triumphalism with a Christian theology of glory. By the right using evangelical Christianity and the right wing of political parties. But I want to expand the discussion today, both by looking at the long history of this conflation, and also by looking at the long history of the relationship between the Christian church and empire, church and state. You have an outline in front of you, I think, and I'm going to just follow that outline as we go through history and talk about each of these things that I think are kind of highlights along the historical trajectory. It's my contention that this conflation of church and state has been with us from the very beginning of the Christian church, and that the Christian and the Christian faith. And I will make a distinction between Christian faith and Christian religion. They're not the same thing. I hope we all understand that. Faith and religion are not the same thing. Christian religion has been used by empire to solidify its power throughout history. It was not until the founding of our country that with the founders fleeing religious persecution, among other reasons, it's only until the founding of our country that we founded a constitution that dictated the separation of church and state. And that separation is being tested, I think, today, as we talked about last week. Political parties are again using religion to further political goals and establish what some would call a Christian nation. It is this history, or this Christian national creep, as I call it, that I want to address. And I call it creep because I think there is a danger that these kinds of things kind of creep into our lives, creep into our politics, and also creep into our religion, and they do so gradually and sometimes so innocently that we don't realize it's happening until we reach a certain point. That happened, as you remember, in Nazi Germany. The German people who saw a lot of good things happening kind of went along with it, went along with it until it was too late, and they realized it too late. This conjoining of the power and influence of the church with the power and influence of empire started, I believe, with Constantine, the emperor of the Roman Empire. In 313 AD, he issued the Edict of Milan, which granted Christians full authority to observe that religion, that people could observe that religion that they preferred. Now, you'll remember that before this, the followers of Jesus were persecuted and martyred.
You can hit
For
view.
many reasons. It was a terrible time for the followers of Jesus. They were referred to simply as followers of the way. This is extra history has referred to this time period as these Christians were simply the followers of the way meaning the way of the teachings and life of Jesus. Jesus said, "Follow me," and that's what they did. They followed Jesus in his way of living, his teaching. And Constantine was said to himself to have been converted to Christianity. So from this time on, the Edict of Milan and so forth, Christianity becomes official. It was a turning point in history that brought about a fusion of church and state. Constantine called together the Council of Nicaea in 325, from which our Nicene Creed comes, defining the boundaries, the borders of the Christian church. This and thus begins Christendom. And if you think about that title, it says it in the title, Christian and Kingdom, Christendom. Faith, that kind of faith following Jesus now becomes religion, becomes an institutionalized belief system supported by empire. Now we can talk a lot about the
Matter of opinion.
downside of that, and there is a lot of downside of that, switching from simply following Jesus and his teaching to now becoming this official religion with boundaries and definitions and institution and so forth. But we also have to talk about the positive side of that. And the positive side of that is that we're here. We're here. Would we be here had the church not become institutionalized? Would we be here if Constantine had not acted as he did? There are, of course, no answers to the what ifs of history or the what ifs of our life for that matter. So this led from a mindset of Jesus, mindset of servanthood and serving and giving, to a mindset of exceptionalism and triumphalism and victory as an institution of faith. This all led to the second great factor that I've listed in your outline, and that is the Holy Roman Empire. Emphasis on holy and empire, the conjunction again of the two. The Holy Roman Empire lasted from 962 to 1806, a long life, a long history, a long relationship between church and state. The empire was created when Charlemagne, the emperor, was crowned by the Pope Leo III. And the thinking behind this was that since Jesus is enthroned in heaven, and since Jesus enthroned in heaven is over all earthly rulers, then the title of the emperor must be designated by the leader of the church, the follower of Jesus, the successor of Jesus, who was the Pope. And so the Pope is the one then who authorizes and enthrones and crowns the emperor. Again, hand in hand, they work. I'm not going to say a whole lot about the Holy Roman Empire. I think you probably know a lot about that history. The Reformation, Martin Luther, of course, broke up or interrupted, I should say, the Holy Roman Empire. It did not, however, end the church-state relationships. State churches now simply became either Catholic state churches or Protestant state churches, but they were still state churches. And as we know, that arrangement lasts till today in Europe with state churches, and the relationship continues. I'll move on to the third. I'm going through this really fast, folks. I'm sorry, but I'm trying to cover a lot. The third evolution of Christian nationalism, I think perhaps the most important one of all, and that is the doctrine of discovery. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued a papal bull called Dum Diversas. Now note the date, 1452. This is the time period in our world history where a time of discovery. Discoverers were crossing the oceans all over, going in all directions, discovering, quote, and claiming lands all around the globe. From Europe, the discoverers traveled from Europe to these lands. And this bull, now that I think about it, that's a great title, the bull. This bull granted the King of Portugal, from which Columbus sailed, permission to, and I've included, I think, did I include the wording of that? I just want to read through that. Gave permission, and this is, remember now, to other discoverers too, permission to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Muslims and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wherever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and to her successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit. Just stop and think what that's done to our history. Until today, we're still battling the racism that's come out of this religious document. In 1454, another Pope Nicholas issued a second bull called Romanus Pontifex, in which he allowed all European Catholic nations to expand their dominions over the discovered lands, along with the enslavement of native non-Christian pagans in Africa and the New World. Thus begins the period of white Christian colonialism, sanctioned by the church and carried out by empire. Do I need to say more about that one? What impact decisions make in our history is amazing. I want to move on then to the founding of America. And I want to kind of just zero in on there's a lot that can be said about the founders, and there's a lot of variety among the founders from Europe, from different parts of Europe. But I want to zero in on the Puritans and their leader, John Winthrop. In 1630, he said this, or wrote this: "He, God, that is God, shall make us a praise and glory, that men shall say of all succeeding plantations, the Lord made it like this of New England. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill, the eyes of all people are upon us," which is a kind of a quote from the Sermon on the Mount. They saw this new land of freedom as a special blessing and a special chosenness of God, which in turn became justification for subjugating the natives. The founding fathers, contrary to what many people like to say, as they claim were Christian, were not most of them Christian. They were deists. Deists who believed in a God and believed in divine guidance, a kind of predestination, that God was directing them in what they did. This then led to manifest destiny, the belief that this young nation has the God-given right to rule the entirety of the North American continent. And we know the results of that for the Native American peoples, whose treaties were broken over and over again. In 1823, there was a Supreme Court decision. Note 1823, considerably after the founding of this country. 1823, a Supreme Court decision, Johnson versus McIntosh. And this Supreme Court said, and this is a quote, "Under discovery, when European Christian nations discovered new lands, the discovering country automatically gained sovereign and property rights over the lands of non-Christians, non-European people, even though obviously the native people already occupied and owned those lands." Thus, the doctrine of discovery was now legalized by our Supreme Court officially for the taking of Native American lands. Again, the conflation of white European Christianity and the state led all efforts to create a mutual domination, exceptionalism, and triumphalism of America. This all taking place, you'll remember, at the time that we had a constitution that called for the separation of church and state. But that constitutional didn't seem to make much difference in many of the actions that happened. I'm going to move on to the FDR Roosevelt era, 1930s and 1940s. The days of the Great Depression and the failure of President Herbert Hoover to use government power and government assets to counter the revolution or the Depression is what brought Franklin Delano Roosevelt to the presidency. As we know, FDR started many programs and to aid people suffering from the Depression called the New Deal. This began a new period in American history where social programs were initiated and carried out by the government for the good, for the help of the people. Now, FDR was not he was a religious person, and he used religious language to talk about this welfare state, as it has been called, to help people. While the programs rescued many people, it also brought about what something we haven't heard much about, or at least I don't remember reading anything about in my history. It brought about a great backlash against socialism and against FDR. The National Association of Manufacturers and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce united to raise the alarm against FDR and the government programs, led by industrialists and manufacturers and libertarians. The accusation was an accusation about socialism and communism, and later also against Jews. Here I'm going to introduce some names to you that probably most of us have never heard of in our history. I hadn't, I know that. But they played huge roles in the 30s and 40s. First is James Fifield, who was pastor of the First Congregational Church in Los Angeles. He rescued that church from demise and built it into a great mega church. In fact, it was the largest Congregationalist church in the world. It had its own college, it had 14 professors, it ran its own radio program, which was new at that time. And its membership, as I read, its membership read like the Wall Street Journal. Fifield was referred to as the apostle to millionaires. He was paid the equivalent of $1 million a year. Not a bad salary in the Depression for a pastor. The titans of industry and business were associated with him, and Fifield became the spokesman for the conservative call to return to the myth of American exceptionalism and the faith of the founders, and to free enterprise as the Christian way of life. Best exemplified by a capitalist system and by individualism. In 1935, Fifield and President Donald Cowling of Carleton College and William Hocking of Harvard, who was a libertarian philosopher, organized a organization called Spiritual Mobilization. You'll hear about spiritual mobilization for a long time in this talk. In 1938, the organization sent a letter to 70,000 pastors, enlisting them to revolt against Roosevelt and the New Deal. A full-page ad in the Los Angeles Times decried the New Deal as antithetical to the designs of the founding fathers and, of course, to God. spiritual mobilization used an influential advertising agency called the Walter Thompson Company. And they started a mailing campaign called Religion in American Life, or RILE for short. Now, I remember RILE. I used some RILE materials. RILES was still active in the 1960s and 70s. And I was in Monroe at the time, and I remember getting regular mailings from RILE. This organization produced bulletin covers and bulletin inserts for congregations and gave them to congregations free. This was a boon for small rural congregations who had financial difficulties. They could get free bulletins, free worship inserts from RILE and use them. Those bulletin covers and inserts always carried along with them a patriotic message and a pledge of allegiance to the flag and a picture of the flag somewhere on the materials. Again, this was a conflation of faith, freedom, and patriotism and free enterprise. And this was a time of strong patriotism in this country post-World War II. They were seen, and I saw them, I must admit at the time, as innocuous. They were helpful. I didn't see any problem with it. I didn't use a lot of it, but you know, what's wrong with using free materials that have, you know, creep is what was happening. This, in 1940, the National Association of Manufacturers held their annual meeting. 5,000 industrialists attended, all the titans of business and commerce, General Motors, General Electric, Standard Oil, Sears, Roebuck, and so forth. Their keynote speaker was James Fifield. Another name you should know who had enormous influence in the 30s and 40s, and maybe some of you will remember this name, Father Charles Coughlin. Anybody remember? Anybody recall that name? Father Charles Coughlin was from Royal Oak, Michigan. He had what was considered the largest religious radio program in the world in the 1930s. Father Coughlin was a dynamic speaker who spoke and preached against communism, atheism, and the Jews. He called for FDR to be removed by force. He had a message calling for outward revolution. He organized massive rallies to spread his message of fear and anti-Semitic propaganda. He wrote mail to Mussolini, and he translated and published the message of the Nazi leader Goebbels. And he, along with Father Francis Moran of Boston, formed actual militia groups. They trained them and they equipped them with army weapons that they obtained by insiders in the military. And their plan was to overthrow the government and kill government officials, all in the name of God. Father Coughlin brought a spiritual message and authority to a very political goal. Now, does this sound familiar? Think Proud Boys. Fortunately, the FBI had informants in this, and the main leaders of the armed insurrection were arrested before they could act. By the way, Carolyn has given us a sheet with sources on it. And if you want to read more about this period in history, there's a book called The Nazis of Copley Square by Charles Gallagher. Or any of you hear or listen to Rachel Maddow's podcasts? Back there, she has some new podcasts out that follow this whole history of this time period. Another name in 1935 was that of Abraham Veridi, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, who gathered important and wealthy business leaders in Seattle, and they started a Save America program, Save America from Going to the Dogs. 1942, he went to Washington to start the first prayer breakfast for political leaders. In 1945, they formed the International Christian Leadership Organization, which started a network of prayer breakfasts all around the country, mostly for the movers and shakers of the country, with a belief that only religion could save America from declining into godless corruption, socialism, communism, and burgeoning government programs. These breakfasts became a kind of political rite of passage for politicians. In 1949, when Tom Clark and Sherman Minton were appointed to the Supreme Court, it was Veridi who arranged a kind of religious consecration of sorts to dedicate them to their new role in the Supreme Court. All of this now enters into the Harry Truman time period. Harry Truman was one president who poo-pooed all the religious infringement in politics, good old Harry. He resisted the prayer breakfasts for a long time, and often when they were held, he didn't attend them anyway. He was a religious man, but he didn't wear his religion on his sleeve for people to see. And he certainly didn't believe in using religion for political power. Another big name you'll be familiar with at this time period, Billy Graham. Billy Graham started holding massive rallies all around the country to convert people to Christianity. Just a little side story, by the way. Billy Graham attended a meeting at the White House when Veridi tried to convince Truman to have these prayer breakfasts, but it proved to be a disaster. Truman wouldn't go for it. So before he left, Billy Graham asked Truman if it'd be all right if he offered a prayer. Truman, in his natural way, said, "Well, I suppose it can't hurt." Graham wrapped his arms around Truman and prayed while his associates yelled, "Amen," and "Tell it, preacher." After his visit, Graham and his group went outside and held a photo op on the lawn of the White House. And that set Truman off. He's one of those counterfeits only interested in getting his name in the paper, he said. And so he instructed his staff never to welcome Graham into the White House. After which, Billy Graham attacked Truman, criticized him and the Democrats, and publicly chided them for wasting money on welfare and wasting money on the Marshall Plan in Europe. Meanwhile, spiritual mobilization continued their work, and in 1949, they launched 15-minute radio programs called The Freedom Story, warning of creeping socialism. At the same time, patriotism was at its height post-World War II. Probably because of World War II, there was a great pride in American victory, and rightfully so. It was a time when we were all happy and proud that things had turned out the way they were. And many people saw this as a blessing from God, that somehow God had intervened somehow in this, been part of it in some way. And so we enter the Eisenhower-Nixon era. And this era was probably the greatest religious awakening period in our nation's history. In and I'm just going to run through a bunch of things that happened during this Eisenhower-Nixon period. In 1953, the National Association of Evangelicals arranged to have Eisenhower and Nixon and the high-ranking officials sign a statement that the United States government was based on biblical principles. Post-World War II saw U.S. flags placed in congregations. Anybody remember pre-World War II and any flags in the, the U.S. flags came in after World War II as a part of our patriotism. Eisenhower was the first president to be baptized while in office. Massive Billy Graham crusades were happening all around the world. Cecil B. DeMille, you know who Cecil B. DeMille was, the Hollywood producer. He produced this new film called The 10 Commandments. And in order to promote the 10 Commandments, he helped erect thousands of granite monuments to the 10 Commandments and placed them around the country. Monroe, a park in Monroe, has a stone 10 Commandments in it. To this, as far as I know, it's still there. It was when I was there. Probably a result of this period when Cecil B. DeMille had these placed all over. And of course, not just monuments in parks and so forth. It was also the period when schools, my wife taught country schools in Montana and North Dakota, and one of the things on the wall was always the 10 Commandments. And of course, we know 10 Commandments were placed in courthouses all around the country also. Flag Day, June 8th, 1954. Eisenhower signs a bill that the Pledge of Allegiance shall now add one nation under God, which was not in the Pledge of Allegiance before that. April 1954, In God We Trust was put on postage stamps, and in 1956 added to paper money, and of course coins also. The seal of the United States, the motto of the United States, ever since 1782, had been E pluribus unum, one out of many, or out of many one, had been our U.S. motto. And June 30th, 1956, that was changed to In God We Trust. See how much was going on in these 50s? Religion in America life was in its heyday during this time, as I've talked about. James Dobson, Focus on Family. How many of you are familiar with that? Again, when Focus on Family started, that's just what it was. It was materials made available to congregations, Sunday schools in particular, to focus on family life, to strengthen family life. There were marriage programs. I used some of them in Monroe. They were I had some pretty good materials that I think one of them we used was on marriage, strengthening of marriages. So there were some good materials. Gradually, however, they morphed into a kind of something very different, into a very, very right-wing political influence. Creep again. This was the time of Ralph Reed, Tim LaHaye, Jerry Falwell, all those names on the right wing. And of course, this was a time when churches were full. This was a great time for us pastors. Churches were filled. Churches were growing. Churches were sprouting up all over. We had a heyday in the 60s and 70s. And so all this stuff, what could be wrong with all this political, religious stuff that was going on? It was good, right? Creep was happening, I think. I just want to mention some books during this period. In 1953, 1 out of 10 books in America was religious in nature. The top 10 bestsellers included Power of Positive Thinking, Angel Unaware, Life is Worth Living, A Man Called Peter, This I Believe, The Greatest Faith Ever. The 2 most popular fiction books were The Robe and The Silver Chalice. By the way, that was helpful to us pastors, having all this religious stuff out there, right? Films, movies, the blockbuster movies. In 1949, it was Samson and Delilah. In 1951, it was David and Bathsheba and Quo Vadis. In 1955, it was A Man Called Peter. In 1956, it was the 10 Commandments. In 1959, it was Ben-Hur and Solomon and Sheba. In 1960, it was the story of Ruth. Again, a lot of religious awakening, a lot of religious stuff going on at this time period. This was the time on TV for Billy Graham's Hour of Decision and for Bishop Fulton J. Sheen's program, religious programs. Eisenhower was guest of honor at the first National Prayer Breakfast, and the theme of that first prayer breakfast was Government Under God. Nixon liked these prayer breakfasts so much that he arranged to have the White House worship every Sunday. He didn't go to church, he had church come to him. So they arranged to have worship in the White House every Sunday, and Billy Graham arranged for the speakers to come each week. The worship bulletins, of course, had the official presidential seal on them. And, this raised a debate, of course, about whether such religious activities in the White House was political or not. But here's a quote from one of Nixon's aides. Remember Charles Colson, white Watergate figure? Charles Colson wrote this: "Sure, we use prayer breakfasts and church services and all that for political ends. One of my jobs in the White House was to romance religious leaders. We turned those events into wonderful quasi-social, quasi-spiritual, quasi-political events and brought in a whole host of religious leaders to hold worship services for the president and his family. And 300 guests carefully selected by me for political purposes." Another one of Nixon's aides was Eric Haldeman, you remember, that Watergate figure. Eric Haldeman had been with the same advertising company that promoted spiritual mobilization that we talked about earlier, and freedom under God ceremonies, and for the advertising council of that RIAL, Religion in America. He had been on the board of that Religion in America campaign. One of the books on my list is from a book called The True Flag. And I want to just have a quote from that. I think it kind of summarizes this progression, this period, this seep that took place. The larger efforts of the Nixon administration to use religious nationalism for its own ends stem not just from the readily apparent polarization of the early 70s, but from the forgotten polarization of the 30s as well. In their struggle against the New Deal, the business lobbies of the Depression era had allied themselves with conservative religions and cultural leaders, and in so doing set in motion a new dynamic in American politics. The activism of Christian libertarians, such as James Fifield and Abraham Vereide, had sought to provide the right with its own brand of public religion that would challenge the social gospel of the left. But the rhetoric and rituals they created lived on after their heyday, becoming a constant in American political life. There were theologians at the time who did make a distinction between what they called civil religion and biblical religion. And that's an important distinction that I think we need to make, because America by this time had created their own brand of civil religion. And if we look at that kind of national civil religious ideas, they are a far cry from biblical religion. That the civil religion was an amalgamation of patriotism, triumphalism, manifest destiny, and religion, defining America as God's chosen nation. Just another little interesting note. There were 8 presidents from FDR to Jimmy Carter. And in that time period of 8 presidents from FDR to Jimmy Carter, they called on God's blessing for the nation in less than half of their speeches. From Ronald Reagan till today, God bless America is used 9 out of 10 times in public speeches. I thought about that, and I think if any president today were not to add God bless America to his speeches, I think it'd be political suicide. I think he'd be accused of being irreligious or unfaithful or unchristian or whatever. It's become so much a part of, and there's nothing wrong with asking God to bless America, is there? That's fine. In our private life, at least, in our private prayers. But it gives the impression publicly that God's on the side of America. And again, raises the wrong kind of creep, I think. So I think the God strategy has become the norm in American life. And that leads us then to MAGA, Make America Great Again, which I'm not going to say anything about because I think we covered last week partly. And we've heard that definition of Christian nationalism during this period of MAGA. And I just think we need to emphasize in this whole trajectory, this whole evolution, this whole creep. And it happens so gradually, and each thing in and of itself is not a bad thing. We can isolate each thing as a good thing, but it's like Germany before World War II, where there's this creep that leads us to a point where we don't want to be. I think that's the danger today that we face. It must be emphasized that these efforts are not mobilizing for religious ends. They are mobilizing for political ends. And therein is the danger, I think. Political ends to gain power in the political arena. And in the process of doing so, I think breaks down the constitutional separation of church and state. I'm going to end there. A lot of stuff, too much stuff, and just then take any comments. Really stumped you on that one.
Thank you very much. Give them a round of applause.
Larry, thank you so much. I have wondered, in terms of the 30s, when there were really so many attacks on the unions and the relationship of the unions here in the United States to those in Europe and Russia, and the extent to which that bore on what the manufacturers, the people of moneyed power had in using the word communism, and that sort of stuck. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I didn't. Was there a question?
Well, did you have any thoughts on how that played in? Because the power people were the manufacturers, and
Yeah,
that's
right.
true in this state today.
Unions were a threat to corporations, and so that's been a part of our history. You know that the power brokers are usually always against having unions, and workers were, that ties in with the communism. Worker uprising, was what communism was about, and so it fit right in with this anti-communist feeling.
So I remember in the church I was raised in, I mean, we had a Christian flag, and would even in Sunday school would say a pledge to the Christian flag. I pledge allegiance to the Christian flag and to the Savior for whose kingdom it stands. And can't remember the rest. Maybe that's a good thing. I guess don't know when that came about, but I don't know if
I'm not familiar with that either, because
Okay.
I'm not.
yeah, we even had
Anyone else remember
No.
a pledge of the Christian flag? Yeah.
we had a pledge to
Yeah,
the Bible.
we had a flag, a Christian flag and
Yeah.
a US flag always in the chancel.
Yeah.
By the way, that's
Yeah.
still, you see that all over
Yeah.
the country yet
Yeah.
today. I've been to a lot of interim congregations and they're there. We took them out in Monroe.
Yeah.
A good way to get them out is to have a building program.
Yeah. Yeah.
Remodel the entire of the church and then just forget to putting them back.
Yes. We also had a pledge to the Bible as well.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Now, what's your background?
Southern Baptist.
Okay. You back here, some other people remember, same, okay.
The community I was raised in, the liberal church was a Methodist. So the church that I was raised in, which was called the Church of Christ, which is like a more Baptist than the Baptist, like more Baptist than the Baptist. But it was a small church, and so we had to attend church as much as my parents wanted to attend. We had to go to Baptist churches as well to make up the time, and so vacation Bible school, that kind of thing, revivals, and it was always a conflation of Christianity and politics, or a political slant.
Taylor, great job. So how do your peers feel about all this? I know there's a whole plethora of opinions, but within ELCA or any Protestantism in general, is this like a frontal mind issue, or is this something under the rug, or what do you think?
Come back next week. Seriously, next week, they're going to have a video from our bishop, ELCA bishop. It is being approached by the ELCA and the Anglican Church, right? So it's the bishop from the Anglican Church, and having a conversation about it. And I think a lot of, and say peers, a lot of people are kind of alarmed about Christian nationalism. However, it's not always true. My sister is a member of a congregation in Palmyra, Wisconsin, which is the opposite right now. Unfortunately, they had a great pastor in the past. That great pastor in the past is no longer there, so it's sitting right back here. Yeah.
Doesn't sometimes even the telling of history reinforce Christian nationalism? I'm thinking of the Crusades. Back in history of the 14, 15, 1600s, when you have rather the 15, 1600s, when you have wars between Catholic and Protestant countries. I'm thinking of our times, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which in many Central European countries it was facilitated by the Pope and the importance of Catholic religion in those countries.
Yeah, I think, and that's why I mentioned during the period of the Holy Roman Empire, that led to, holy wars, crusades, and led to great domination and power of the church over people's lives. And that's the danger, I think, of conflating religion and empire. It wields such power over people's lives, and not certainly in a good way. Think of Central and South America. Only recently have they broken away from that kind of religious domination in the South America and Central America. And it led to revolutions all over.
Pastor Larry, thank you. But one of my thoughts is the role of the theology of prosperity in Calvinism and the elect, and then we throw that against the Gospel of Luke, and where does this fit?
It fits. You're right, and that's a whole nother area we could get into. Is the theological side of this. I mean, the predestination, the idea that somehow God is in charge of all this and is causing all this to happen. I mean, that's such a dangerous principle, and has led to, again, all kinds of problems. I forget what else you mentioned there, but
The theology of prosperity.
theology of prosperity. Yeah, God's on your side. If you're making it, man, God's on your side and he's going to benefit you. You just do it right and God will provide for you. Right? Yes. And by the way, that on your sheet, there's the sources. There's one on Douglas John Hall has a book called The Cross in Our Context. And that book has one chapter in it, I think it's chapter 8, about Christendom and the dangers and the effects that Christendom has caused. And I think that's a very good, conversation about that.
So Larry, the in God we trust, which God is that? The Jewish God, the Muslim God, the Christian God?
Well, you're right. That raises the issue. I mean, who God are we talking about? I used to in confirmation, one of the first things I always ask confirmation, kids is, you know, do you have faith or what's your faith? Well, I believe in God. Is always the answer. I believe in God. My response is, what God you talking about? You know?
Thank you. Thank you so much. More of a just a comment. It's so interesting how, Europe, this is where a lot of this began, that European society has evolved over time to be, they're prosperous free market societies from Scandinavia to other Germany and other parts of Europe, different flavors. And yet they've found a way to embrace things like healthcare for their citizens. And they're very prosperous societies, and I just think it's fascinating how how that has not eventually evolved in the United States as well.
Yeah.
How these ideas that this is a bad thing, it's socialism and should be rejected. I find that so interesting still.
Well, yeah, it is interesting, the fact that there are still state churches in Europe, but I think I don't know. I don't know about those churches and so forth, but what appears to me is that the way they deal with it is just by not going to church.
We have a question from someone on Zoom. Bianca asked, what does the Christian right tell itself to justify racism? And how can the true teachings of Christ gain louder attention from the media?
How does it say that? I'm sorry.
What does the Christian right tell itself to justify racism? And how can the true teachings of Christ gain louder attention from the media?
Oh, I can't answer for the Christian right, but I would guess that, white evangelicalism, white Christian nationalism. I mean, Europe, our theology has always come from Europe until recently. And that white, and that means white Christian. And there's always been this presumption, I think, that God is started with white Christians.
I just wanted to mention, Carolyn asked me to mention that she has several books in the back that you can look at. You can't take them right now, but you can take a look and see what books are there.
I don't know if the media is the right place for the message of following Jesus. And it's somewhere in the Bible where when the early Christian communities were known for taking care of widows and orphans and those who had nothing and nobody. And others looked at those followers of Jesus and said, see how they love. So I think we are the message. We are the message. So I'm not sure the media would be as helpful as what we're doing, because we are that message. And for us to be known as how we love is kind of just always in my brain.
I thank you for that. And I think that one of the reasons the media is not adequate in that sense is that there are too many different sides of our Christian message. And, they unfortunately have been taken over too much by that side that's more. No. But by the way, before we, I just want to make one comment. I think Karen and I talked about this. I think the big winner in this past election, as some have said, is democracy. I think democracy won in this last election, and I am very encouraged, and even from the fact that I think Christian nationalism took a hit in all of this.
I hope. I just wanted to come back to, I don't know your name. Yeah, but the second lesson today has that one line in it about if any would not work, neither should he eat. I mean, what I'm not saying it, I'm saying it's sort of in the King James version, but that to me, that one passage is part of what I think personally goes on in government and in people's minds many times. Kind of the to me, greediness of that, or the lack of empathy, that if you don't work, you don't get food. And that's what struck me throughout Katie's really good sermon. I couldn't get my mind off that one passage, which always bothers me and has a lot to do, I think, with the kinds of decisions that are made politically and get really ingrained. But that's just my opinion.
Well, one more comment, and then I think yeah, one more comment from you. And then I think you'll probably be here for a couple moments, but we probably better let people go to church if they want to hear that great sermon, if you haven't already. Do
Thank you very much.
you have another comment?
I don't have any.
Thanks a lot, Reverend Pinnow.